The air in the garden was heavy with the scent of lavender and early summer jasmine, a fragrant reminder of the life she'd once imagined for herself. Elena ran her hands over the worn wooden rail of the gate, scanning the overgrown plot that had once been the pride of her husband's family. The garden, now tangled with weeds and wildflowers, seemed to mirror her own tangled emotions: longing, grief, and a faint glimmer of hope. It had been only 6 months since David's passing, and inheriting this estate was something she hadn't expected. David's family was distant. They lived scattered across the countryside, with few, if any, maintaining much contact. Samuel, the reclusive cousin she'd met only briefly at the funeral, had been the only one to reach out. And now here he was, a silent figure with rough hands and a careful manner, standing at the edge of the garden with a look of quiet determination. "Mind if I help?" Samuel's voice was gentle, though it carried a weight that seemed to make even the birds fall silent. He spoke with the carefulness of someone who valued silence more than most. "Of course. I could use all the help I can get," Elena replied, surprised by how welcome his presence felt. Samuel's knowledge of plants had already proven invaluable. In just a few weeks, they'd managed to restore the herb garden, pulling out tangled roots and pruning the neglected roses. As they worked, Elena found herself captivated by Samuel's steady presence. He was as meticulous as he was reserved, rarely offering more than the occasional quiet observation about the plants they worked on. Yet there was something about his company that soothed her, a calming presence that spoke more in silence than in words. "It's peaceful out here," Elena murmured, mostly to herself. Samuel looked up, his deep-set eyes reflecting the golden light. "Gardens have a way of teaching patience," he replied, his tone introspective. "They teach you to wait, to let things grow in their own time." The words lingered, filling the quiet between them as they worked side by side, tending to the forgotten beauty around them. Elena found herself growing more comfortable with Samuel, sensing a depth in him that invited her to speak of things she had rarely shared. His presence felt like the solid ground she had been searching for after the whirlwind of grief and loneliness that had consumed her. She caught herself watching him sometimes, studying the careful way he handled the plants, almost as if each one held a secret he alone understood. One afternoon, as they were trimming the hedges along the garden path, she asked, "Why did you stay around here, Samuel? I mean, the rest of David's family is scattered far and wide." Samuel hesitated, his shears pausing mid-cut. "I suppose it's easier to stay where the memories are," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet melancholy. "Sometimes it feels like the only place I belong." His words surprised her, resonating with her own experience. David's death had left her feeling rootless, a widow at 36 with no direction and no anchor. She thought she knew her husband well, but in the aftermath, she realized how many things had been left unspoken between them. They continued their work in silence until, at sunset, they took a break by the old stone bench near the edge of the garden. Samuel handed her a worn cloth to wipe her hands, and they sat quietly, watching the last rays of sunlight play across the leaves. The silence between them had become a familiar comfort, a shared language they both understood. David never spoke much about his family, Elena ventured, trying to make sense of the family history that felt like an enigma. "It's strange, being surrounded by all these memories without truly understanding them." Samuel nodded slowly, his gaze lost in the distance. David, he kept things close to the chest. Even from family, he was the kind of man who lived by his own rules, but he was also a man who could carry a great deal without showing it. A flicker of curiosity passed over Elena's face. Samuel rarely spoke of David in personal terms, and this glimpse into his late husband's character made her feel closer to him, even if he was no longer there. She wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of the family that had always felt closed off to her. "Did you two ever get along?" she asked carefully. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Samuel's mouth, though it was tinged with something bittersweet. "David and I had our differences. He was always the charmer, and I was," he chuckled softly, looking down at his calloused hands. "Well, I suppose I was just a quiet sort of man. We didn't see eye to eye on many things, but we respected each other. In our own ways. Elena nodded, thinking about her own complicated marriage to David. There had been a love there, certainly, but it had been marked by unspoken disappointments and half-fulfilled promises. She had never been able to shake the feeling that David had kept parts of himself closed off from her. And now, in the quiet moments of her new life, she was left to confront those mysteries alone. Over the next few days, they worked in close harmony, wordlessly tending to the garden's overgrowth, discovering forgotten flowers that had lain dormant for years. Samuel's skill with plants revealed itself in the way he coaxed life back into the wilted blooms, his touch gentle yet firm. Elena found herself enjoying the quiet rhythm of their days, the way the silence allowed her mind to wander, unraveling old memories and reshaping them into something softer, something bearable. One evening, as they were finishing up for the day, Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to her with a hesitant look. "I think you should have this." Elena took the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was a letter, worn and faded from years of being kept close. She recognized David's handwriting immediately. Her breath caught as she read the first few lines. A letter written to Samuel that spoke of regrets, of choices that had left David feeling trapped and unfulfilled. "Why did you keep this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked down, his hands fidgeting with a stray leaf. "I suppose it was a reminder," he said finally. "A reminder of the paths we choose and the ones we don't. David and I, we had a complicated relationship. He confided things in me that he couldn't tell anyone else, and for a long time I thought that was enough." Elena's mind reeled with the weight of the words on the page, realizing that there had been an intimacy between Samuel and David that she had never fully understood. The letter was raw, filled with the kind of honesty she had rarely seen from her husband, a glimpse into a man she had loved but had never truly known. The silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and quiet revelations. She looked at Samuel, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Here was a man who had held onto a piece of David's soul, a man who had been both a confidant and a silent witness to the life she thought she understood. "Thank you for showing me this," she said softly, folding the letter carefully and handing it back to him. Samuel shook his head, his gaze steady. "It's yours now. I think he would have wanted you to know." That night, Elena couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of David, of Samuel, of the garden they had begun to bring back to life together. The letter lingered in her thoughts, a reminder of the fragility of human connections, of the secrets people carried, even from those closest to them. She had spent so much time grieving her husband's death, but now she found herself grieving the parts of him she had never known, parts that had remained hidden in the shadows of their life together. The next morning, she walked into the garden early, hoping to find peace in the familiar rhythm of pulling weeds and pruning flowers. She wasn't surprised to see Samuel already there, his back turned as he carefully tended to the roses. The early morning sun cast a warm glow over the garden, illuminating the delicate blooms they had worked so hard to revive. "Could we talk for a moment?" she asked, her voice tentative. Samuel turned, his expression unreadable. "Of course." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I never realized how much of David I didn't understand. Reading that letter, it was like meeting a stranger, a man I thought I knew but never truly did." Samuel nodded, a sadness passing over his face. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones who keep the deepest secrets. Elena looked down, feeling the weight of his words. She had spent years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, only to find that her efforts had only brushed the surface of who David truly was. And now, with Samuel standing before her, she felt a strange kinship, a connection forged not just by shared memories but by the shared experience of having known and loved a man who had kept parts of himself hidden away. As they stood there, A quiet understanding passed between them, a recognition of the grief they both carried, of the pieces of themselves they had given to a man who was no longer there to accept them. The garden around them seemed to breathe with the weight of their shared silence, each bloom a testament to the lives they had led, the loves they had lost, and the secrets they had chosen to hold. As the days went on, Elena and Samuel's connection deepened, almost without either of them realizing it. Their shared understanding of David's complexities brought an unspoken bond, one rooted in acceptance and quiet respect. The garden flourished under their care, its colors growing more vibrant, its blooms richer, as if reflecting the sense of renewal each felt working side by side. One evening, a soft drizzle started as they worked, the gentle patter of rain on leaves lending a peaceful, almost ethereal quality to the twilight. Elena didn't mind the rain, it felt cleansing, as if it could wash away the layers of grief and confusion she had carried with her since David's death. Samuel, however, noticed her growing cold and offered his old flannel jacket, the fabric warm and slightly worn from years of use. She hesitated but then slipped it on, feeling an unexpected warmth settle over her as she rolled up the sleeves to fit her smaller frame. They finished up the evening's work, lingering under the spreading branches of the ancient oak at the garden center, where Samuel had painstakingly pruned vines and planted new flowers to revive the area. There was a particular flower one Samuel had introduced to the garden, an evening primrose that only bloomed at dusk. Its yellow petals glowed softly in the fading light, and Elena watched, entranced, as the blooms unfolded, delicate and almost otherworldly in their beauty. "They're incredible," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. Samuel nodded, his gaze steady and contemplative. "Evening primroses. They bloom only at night. Some say they're symbolic of hidden beauty, of the things that reveal themselves only when the world is quiet." He paused, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "They remind me of David. And you." Elena felt her heart catch at his words. She wasn't sure how to respond, and yet she felt an urge to reach out, to bridge the gap that had existed between them since the day they'd met. There was something about Samuel's quiet presence that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time, as if he could understand the depths of her grief without her having to say a word. "Samuel," she began, unsure of how to proceed, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done here, for helping me find something beautiful in this place when I thought all I'd feel was loss." Samuel's eyes softened, and he shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, Elena. I think I needed this garden as much as you did." A gentle silence fell between them, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty, as if every word left unspoken was understood without explanation. And then, unexpectedly, he reached out, his fingers brushing hers. It was a small, tentative gesture, yet it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. In that moment, Elena felt a surge of warmth, of something alive and pulsing beneath the surface. She looked down at their hands, a mixture of confusion and curiosity swirling within her. She hadn't expected to feel anything like this again, and certainly not with Samuel, the reserved cousin who had seemed so distant and unknowable. But as they stood together, the rain misting around them, she felt a sense of inevitability, as though their connection was something that had been quietly growing all along, waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. Perhaps we're both looking for the same thing," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Samuel's hand tightened gently around hers, and for a moment they simply stood there, bound by the unspoken emotions that had grown between them. He didn't speak, and she was grateful for it. Words would have been inadequate to capture the strange, undeniable pull she felt, a mixture of grief, gratitude, and something that felt suspiciously like hope. As the rain began to ease, they lingered by the blooming primroses, watching as the last of the blossoms opened in the twilight. It felt as if the garden itself was bearing witness to the fragile new bond forming between them, its flowers opening to the night as they, too, opened themselves to a feeling they hadn't anticipated. In the days that followed, Elena found herself thinking about Samuel more often, noticing the way his presence filled the once empty spaces of the estate. She would catch herself watching him work, the quiet concentration on his face, the way he seemed to blend seamlessly into the rhythm of the garden. She couldn't deny the way her heart quickened whenever he looked at her, a look that held both understanding and something deeper, something she dared not name. One evening, Samuel surprised her by inviting her to a part of the estate she had yet to explore, the greenhouse, a hidden gem tucked behind a wall of ivy. It was filled with an assortment of rare plants, each one labeled carefully in Samuel's meticulous handwriting. The air was humid, the earthy scent of soil mingling with the fragrant blooms. There was a sense of tranquility in the greenhouse, as if it existed outside of time, a sanctuary untouched by the outside world. Elena marveled at the array of plants, their vibrant colors softened by the gentle evening light filtering through the glass. Samuel watched her, a faint smile tugging at his lips, as she wandered from one plant to the next, her fingers grazing the delicate leaves and petals. This was David's favorite place, he said quietly, his voice reverent. He used to come here when he needed to think, to get away from everything. Elena nodded, understanding the sentiment. She could see why David had loved it here, the peacefulness, the sense of solitude. But as she looked around, she realized that Samuel's hand was evident in every corner of the greenhouse. This place wasn't just David's, it was Samuel's too, a testament to his love of nature and his quiet dedication to preserving beauty. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I feel like I'm finally seeing a side of David that I never knew. And a side of you too." Samuel's eyes softened, and he looked away, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it's easier to keep parts of ourselves hidden," he replied. "But maybe some things are meant to be shared." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elena felt a flutter of anticipation, a sense that something was shifting, that the quiet understanding they had developed was deepening into something more. She took a step closer, her gaze steady as she looked up at him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and longing. "Samuel," she hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know what I'm feeling, but I know it's real." He reached out, his hand grazing her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, closing her eyes as she felt the warmth of his palm against her skin. It was a simple gesture, yet it held a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "You don't have to say anything, Elena," he murmured. "Some things don't need words." They stood there in the stillness of the greenhouse, the world outside forgotten, as they lost themselves in the quiet intensity of the moment. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Samuel leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a gentle, hesitant kiss that sent a thrill through her entire being. The kiss was soft, tentative, yet it held a quiet passion that neither of them could ignore. Elena felt her heart race, a warmth spreading through her that was both comforting and exhilarating. This was a moment she hadn't expected, a connection she hadn't planned. But as their lips parted and they looked into each other's eyes, she felt a sense of certainty, a feeling that this was where she was meant to be. They lingered in the greenhouse as the evening faded into night, the quiet intimacy between them growing as they shared stories, laughter, and stolen glances. It was a fragile, delicate connection, yet it felt unbreakable, as if the garden had woven them together in its own quiet, patient way. As they left the greenhouse, hand in hand, Elena felt a sense of peace, a calm that had eluded her for so long. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since David's death, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that love could grow again, even in the most unexpected places. The garden, once a place of loss and solitude, had become a sanctuary of healing, a reminder that life, like nature, had a way of finding beauty even in the shadows.